is awesome, man, to see you again. I can't wait to get into Erich Fromm again. I know we have a lot that we want to cover. This is part 2 of our little series, Thinking with Erich Fromm. And yeah, man, like, where do you think we should start?
Yeah, it's good to be back. We can start wherever you left off on your own specific reading that you wanted to talk
Okay.
about.
Yeah, no. Okay, so where I think we should start is based on your recommendation, and I'll throw it up on the screen. You recommended Kieran Durkin's incredible book, The Radical Humanism of Erich Fromm. And I'm several chapters in since you recommended it. I'm really digging it and learning a lot. You know, building on kind of where we left off in the previous episode, we were getting into Fromm's radical humanism and even this idea of a type of basic essentialism. And one of the things that I want to say that really kind of struck me this morning was, Kieran early on in the book is saying for Fromm, his essentialism wasn't necessarily about this substance or this thing that we can point to inside the human. It's more about this existential, what he calls contradiction, or even a question that man has to wrestle with. And one of the ways that he frames that is by describing Fromm's position as an existential anthropology. And one of the ways he fleshes that out is by saying that, and this is kind of an interesting phrase, he actually gets it from Fromm, we are actually freaks of nature. And the way that he describes that is, in our evolutionary history, there's no doubt that we're connected to the other species. We're these biological creatures. But what makes us freaks is that we now have the capacity for reason, for self-transcendence, for self-reflection, self-awareness, and that actually creates a type of division or contradiction. And how we end up coping with that sort of contradiction gets us thinking about these existential needs that you and I think are going to talk about. Mm-hmm. So before we get into those, is there anything else that you want to say about his essentialism or his humanism or this idea of an existential anthropology?
Yeah, well, the existential anthropology is, I think it's an interesting phrase because he does kind of map out, what it means to be human, and I think that's the cartography, right, of how he actually goes about discussing almost like the specific contradictions that exist at every stage of human development, right? That's the interesting part about the existential anthropology that I really appreciate from Fromm. When it comes to being a freak of nature, actually, this is where I slightly disagree with Fromm.
Okay.
So in my own work, actually, I've been, deeply thinking about this division that he creates about us being like apparently different than when nature actually when nature actually is, right? Because he makes this, he comes up with this story that nature is harmonious and it's somehow deterministic and there's a passivity to it. In the way that Fromm discusses nature. And I actually have a huge problem with that. My own work being an environmental political theorist, I don't look at nature in that sense. And actually, this is where I think Fromm is making like
like a caricature?
A caricature and a deterministic duality that I don't necessarily think needs to be there.
Can I pause you real quick? Do you mind if I pause you? No, this is incredible, man, and I want you to go deeper. I just want to throw out there too, just a question, and again, I'm kind of getting this from Kieran's work and some of the things I've read from Fromm. One of Fromm's major influences is a type of Judaism, right? And he actually roots his existential anthropology in part in the Adam and Eve creation story, which we talked about last time. And there is kind of this mythological conception of a time before things went sideways, right? A type of primordial peace or order. And so I'm wondering if your push against the idea of freaks of nature will kind of get into a critique of that.
Yeah, I would say that I think one of the critiques of Fromm that I've had, great discussions with friends of mine is, he's not a very good historian. That's the problem with Fromm, and he makes this. It's a convenient story to simplify aspects of history so that we can have this more coherent understanding of human development, which I think, when it comes to the actual simplicity of what he's trying to explain, I think he does a great job in capturing that. But I also think he misses the nuances of the chaos that exists within history, for the sake of the story. And one of those things, for example, someone like Jason Moore would poo-poo from here. Jason would definitely say that there's a lot more chaos, right, going on in this history as if nature mattered perspective that he kind of embodies, and I definitely want to shine a light on that a little more, and maybe push from. That's what I'm doing in my own work, pushing from on this idea that nature is passive and harmonious when it actually isn't. Nature has a lot more conflict, right? It's as conflictual as human history is, and I do think that Fromm has his orientation is a lot better for the human understanding side of it than it is the nature explanation side of it, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's so good, man. Okay, I'm going to have to really kind of wrestle with that. And I think even in a cursory, like listening to you, I think I would probably agree and be on your side on this one. One of the things that maybe I've been wondering about, your perspective and Fromm is there a place in what you study and what you do to talk about the uniqueness of the human species, or is that problematic in light of what you were talking about?
No, there's still room to talk about the uniqueness of the human species without sugarcoating what actually goes on in nature as well, right?
Okay.
Because it's all one nature, right? Like, I don't want to, and I'm sure Fromm, like, if he were alive, he would probably agree that it is all just one nature. Of course, the appearance of it is what takes different shapes and forms, right? And something that I always think about is like the way we talk about the story needs to reflect like similar patterns. Like, if human history has inherent contradictions, then why can't nature have inherent contradictions, right? Or, right, it's the same thing. Like, we have to talk about human history as another side of nature. It's not outside of it, right?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So okay, I mean, let's just unpack this a little bit. And I'm sure in part this is my own ignorance, just trying to understand it all. But I'm going to try to kind of paraphrase or summarize what you're saying. Like, what you struggle with in terms of the concept of freaks of nature is that it creates like an unnecessary dichotomy or dualism between humanity and nature.
Right. There's what Jason would call a Cartesian dualism going on.
A Cartesian dualism.
So
okay.
He would fall there in like some like Enlightenment style trap. That's what you would call like a unnecessary abstraction, right? Like, he's abstracting so much, at least in this sense of reality between nature and human development, that it's not necessarily capturing what's going on in reality, right? Or it's capturing one facet of it, but it's not being nuanced enough to actually show you that it's actually these complex layers that exist, and human history is just one of those complex layers, right? But it's all one nature. It's all one nature.
Sure. And again, I'd want to be really careful not to speak for Kieran. Obviously, actually, he and I are kind of in conversation. We're hoping to have him on the podcast to discuss the book at some point, which I'm really excited about. But I mean, I know one of the threads in his book that he goes back to time and time again is the influence that Judaism, a certain interpretation of Judaism, had for Fromm. And in this chapter where he's getting into this existential anthropology, he says at one level, Fromm is basically building on the kind of classic religious distinction between the body and the soul, which, I think could be seen as a type of Cartesian dualism. So that's really interesting that you kind of I guess, would you still say though that there's maybe, or maybe, let me ask it this way. What then is the kind of difference that humans embody? So if I'm with you 100%, like we shouldn't create this dualism. There's a greater continuity between humans and nature. A la Jason Moore. What then are the ways that we should talk about humans? What is their distinctiveness?
Right. So I do think that an aspect of human distinctiveness that I think Fromm really, shines a light on is this idea of self-awareness. I
Okay.
do think that that's uniquely human. And even though nature, we're talking about it from a Cartesian dualist perspective, right? Like
Right.
if we're traditionally talking about nature as this thing that just runs itself on instincts, then yes, like we are different. But I also, as we were talking about before in our last episode, human beings' developments of culture is also an evolutionary development, right? This is that also another aspect of that existential anthropology, right? That we've now moved away from instinctual needs, and now we're in a sense on the driver's seat of our own instinctual awareness, right? So we're making choices not based on our biological programming, but based on our passions and our emotions, right, and our reason, which is one of the things that Fromm talks about.
Yeah. See, I guess, and again, like I have just started getting into Fromm, and maybe I'm wanting to read him a little bit more charitably at this point, because again, I'm really kind of digging with what you're saying and the framework you're bringing. But when I was thinking about him and Kieran's approach, I kept on thinking he's actually trying to have like a both and, like there's both continuity with the other animals in nature, like he has an evolutionary framework. He's just really wanting to emphasize the but, or the distinction.
Yeah.
Whether we say it's reason or self-awareness or self-transcendence, self-reflection, which I think human culture comes out of that capacity.
Right. And it's in that very sense of the idea that we were talking about one of these aspects of this, one of the qualitative elements of this existential anthropology is this idea for transcendence, right? So there's an aspect of what it means to be human. But here's the thing: it's not just human. I do think this is also reflected in nature as well. Nature is constantly dying and transforming itself and dying and rebirthing, dying and rebirthing, dying and rebirthing. We share that quality, right? That's a quality we bring with us, but we humanize it. Like we humanize the quality to give ourselves purpose, right? To give ourselves meaning. And what we do with that meaning is that, we can create marvels, right? We can create incredible structures. We can do incredible things with that energy. That's a natural energy that is translated to us from nature. And then we take that energy and we transform it into something that exists that didn't exist before, right? So we're building, there's this term called biomimicry, for example.
Biomimicry?
Biomimicry. I learned this recently, actually, and it's ways of developing society so that we mimic more natural processes. So we're building architectural designs for not just buildings, but for roads and different aspects of our everyday society that we don't really take into account, that aren't really doing anything to provide this regenerative process that exists within nature. And that's there's an argument there that's one way to mitigate some of the climate issues that exist, and we can start using roads to give us more energy by trying to make it more solar powered. For example, like solar powered roads. We can have green. These spaces that that hold plants, for example. You can put them on top of buildings. We can be more attuned to nature in the way that we're creating our societies, as opposed to how we're doing it now, where it's just growth for the sake of growth without giving anything back, and all we're doing is being extractive, right? Like that's the purpose of our society today. Yeah.
No, totally, man. Well said. You know, when you talk about biomimicry, I hadn't heard that phrase. It's really fascinating. I do think about, this was maybe a year or so ago, I had someone on the podcast who did work in nature. He worked at a nature center, and he talked about bioengineering as an aspect of this. I think there's maybe something similar. Is there an issue with that though, from your facial expression?
I think bioengineering is a little different to this idea of biomimicry.
Okay.
I do think the biomimicry part of it, like, like if we're still using like Frommian framework,
sure,
biomimicry still holds like a certain aspect of appreciating nature more and wanting to be like it. So there's less of a having orientation and more of a being orientation. So we're trying to mimic the orientations that exist in nature. Engineering, right? The bioengineering already has a certain level. It's not that it's extractive, but it's forcibly transformative, right? It's not necessarily working with what exists.
Got you.
It's trying to take control, because engineering has a certain aspect of control in it that doesn't necessarily gravitate towards a more harmonious engagement.
Well, dude, thank you for pointing this out. Yeah. Thank you for pointing it, because I think as I'm really thinking about it and listening to what you're saying, I'm thinking, damn, I'm sure some people take, bioengineering and just use it for capitalist ends, right? They figure out how to make more money.
There's a whole like orientation within environmental political thought that it's called ecological modernization, and they use these ideas of green technologies and bioengineering as a way to greenify capitalist endeavors, right? Which is, to me, a little sinister.
Yeah,
I don't necessarily buy into that. Yeah.
Okay. Oh man, this is great shit. So okay, how about at this point, and I'll set it up in terms of Kieran's argument, and then maybe you could tell me where you stand on it. But so in this chapter, exploring this idea of this existential anthropology, that the humans sort of are in this evolutionary trajectory, and then however we understand this, there's this self-awareness and there's this capacity for self-transcendence. What that does, to put it a little bit simplistically, is create these existential needs that every human, I don't know how to say it, feels, experiences, wrestles with. And again, this would be, in Kieran's understanding, what he means by a type of essentialism. A basic essentialism is that we all live within these sort of constraints or these existential struggles. And one of those needs, maybe the fundamental one, is relatedness.
Yes. We touched up on relatedness last episode, and I do think relatedness is one of the most foundational existential needs of what it means to be human, right? But it's also, right, relatedness is a natural development, right? Relatedness is like animals do this, right? It's not just us, but for
not just mammals, right? Like reptiles, fish, insects,
all kinds of different animals, even plants, right? Like
even
trees.
Plants, totally.
I love the story of trees, right? Trees like grow roots, but then these roots communicate amongst other trees, and they're creating like these root lines.
It's amazing.
Where other trees around the forest are all communicating with each other. I think that's very, very interesting. Just observations that exist within nature. Obviously, there's always the problem of anthropomorphizing nature.
Sure.
But I do think that there is, there's this cosmic energy that exists, and I think a need for relatedness is a part of this cosmic energy that happens, right? Like if we're looking at things from a primordial perspective, if we're talking about it like more from like a, from a physical material point of view, then someone like Joel Cobble, who I've read and I've really, really just been profoundly influenced by. He's incredible. He talks about the he talks about this need of relatedness between, like, from psychoanalyst perspective, the language that's being used is the death drive and eros, right? So you're looking at the life and death are in this constant conflict with each other, and then there's these dynamic elements that come about, which one could say the whole human history exists through this conflict of life and death, right? But there's also,
who is this? This is fascinating.
Well, this is just a psychoanalytic understanding of
coming out of Freud.
how culture came to be. But then Caldwell takes it an extra step and talks about the more, like, what do you call it, physicist side of it, which would be this idea of generative processes and entropy, right? Entropy from a physicist perspective would be this idea of the death drive, right? Like everything eventually collapses on itself, and life is struggling against entropy, right? And you can see the cosmic DNA that exists, right? Or the dynamic essences of these energic, Caldwell calls them energic relations. These energic relations develop patterns. And in these patterns, it's in that dance that you have these dynamic formations. And he actually says that eventually in these dynamic formations, as you see the spinning of galaxies, right? Galaxies have a shape and a form. It's that very same energy producing human development, right? Like how human beings produce themselves. Yeah. No, it blew me away when I first read it. I was like, wow, this is crazy.
Dude, that's insane. I love that. Yeah, that's like a trip. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe I'll say one last thing about relatedness and get your thoughts. I mean, again, just building off of Kieran's argument, he wants to say, I think he's right, that one of the ways that Fromm wanted to distinguish himself from Freud, kind of the father of psychoanalysis, is on this emphasis of relatedness as being primary. That I guess, to put it kind of simply, we can't have, first and foremost, a theory of the individual in terms of either biology or instincts or drives, and then get into how he or she relates to others, that relatedness is actually primary. That we have to think about humans in the context of the way they relate. And as you're pointing out, more than just humans, but if we're just focusing on the human for a moment, the related social dimension is as important as kind of the individual biological drive, instinct kind of dimension.
100%. Like there's also psychological needs that derive from relatedness, right? And one could say that they're as important, actually as vitally important as our biological needs are, if not more so, right?
Totally.
Because once we have our biological needs are met, right? We have food, we have house, we would bring house, and we have water, and we have all the physical needs that we need. That's not enough for a human being. Like we need, when we lack that, we also can't even get to that self-actualization point as individuals to truly express what it means to be human. But to even get to that true expression of self-actualization, one needs to relate with others.
Yeah.
And that relationship exists with the characteristics of the person's society in which they live in, right? That's the most important part, because we can relate to anything. It's almost like it's a part of our DNA to relate. If we don't relate, Fromm says we go insane. Like we truly go insane. Yeah, we truly go insane. That we become psychotic. I think it's the word you use.
Yeah, no, and you brought this up last time. I know I bring it a lot with just to illustrate the centrality of this with some of my clients. You look at solitary confinement in prisons. You think about prisoners of war. I mean, they do go insane when they're cut off from others at that level. So it's really powerful.
Yeah, and there's almost like a yearning for it. It's like a
yearning,
an intense desire to relate. And here's the thing: like, if we're not exposed to healthy forms of relationships, that doesn't matter to us. We'll relate even to toxic aspects of what it means to exist, right? Because the whole point is to relate. The whole point is to get rid of that internal contradiction that exists in us, right? That's an aspect of Fromm where he's like, there's this contradiction between, wanting to be a part of something bigger than yourself and also being okay with oneself, like wanting to find purpose in one's life. But you can't stay stuck in the conflict forever. You need to overcome that conflict. So how do you overcome that conflict? You relate. If slavery is a thing, you relate to slavery, because it's better to relate to slavery than to not relate at all and just be in this constant conflictual, liminal space where it's cognitive dissonance, right? You're experiencing complete cognitive dissonance all the time, and human beings can't exist in those spaces for very long.
No. Okay. And I think one of the things you're bringing out that I wanted to get into a little bit, maybe this is a good time, is with every single one of these things we're talking about, relatedness, transcendence, rootedness, there are these unhealthy or toxic ways that we can fulfill those needs.
Yes.
Right. It's not just about, okay, you're filling these needs up with something positive. That's the way it's going to go. No, we have these contradictions, as you said, that we're trying to get rid of. But many times we kind of pursue a path that could be quite destructive or is very toxic. But that's just what we're going to do as humans, because we have to relieve that tension. We have to relieve that contradiction.
Yeah, there needs to be what do you call it? Like a pressure valve, right?
Yeah,
the pressure valve for release is just, I think, it's naturally important. Like, I think pressure valves exist in all forms of things, and one of those pressure valves for human beings is to have reprieve. And there's different ways of experiencing reprieve, right? That's something that we can talk about and get deeper in. But I'll just focus a little bit more on rootedness, because I actually do think that rootedness is a really, really important. It's just another important aspect of what it means to exist.
How do you, like, I don't know if I'm looking for a definition, but how do you begin to kind of first think about rootedness for people that are listening that aren't aware of Fromm?
Honestly, the source is in the word itself, right? Roots. So to feel a part of a community, to feel connected to something bigger than yourself. Like that's a huge aspect of what it means to be rooted into something. To feel like you're connected in a community, that you're a part of something, that you don't have to, do it all on your own, and the pressures of existence, right? The conflicts of existence could be shared amongst others. There's that sharing of the burden, right? That exists within rootedness, and I do think that rootedness can be a pressure valve for a lot of these existential dichotomies, right? These existential paradoxes that exist within us, and if we don't have rootedness, you're gonna experience certain aspects of social pathologies and individual pathologies that exist, like aspects of depression and anxiety, right? Like those things are there to remind you that you're unrooted. And I've definitely, I personally felt unrootedness, especially during grad school. There's a huge aspect of being unrooted, and then it forces you to create. Not everyone does this, right? Not everyone does this, but me being as social as I am, it forces me to put myself in uncomfortable positions, to at least try and create community, try and feel rooted in spaces, right, with people and cultures and different kinds of ways of being that speak to me. That's what we're looking for, right? That's what, when people say, like, oh, you come across certain people and you feel attracted to certain forms of people, right, of human experiences, because that attraction is a form of rootedness that you're looking for, right? It's unconscious too. It's unconscious.
Dude, totally. Okay, so I'm going to set up this question by just saying, in a couple hours, my wife and I were headed out of town to go to Waco. Her birthday's on Saturday, so we're just going to, just kind of fuck around and just visit a couple places. But one of the places we want to go to is the kind of home of like the Branch Davidians, David Koresh, kind of the Waco cult. We kind of nerd out about some of that stuff. We like kind of thinking about the psychology of cults because we're kind of a little bit twisted. But I think about toxic forms of religion. I think about cults as really unhealthy forms of rootedness. And so in setting that up, I wonder if you could speak to whether it's organized religion or whether it's, you know, toxic political movements or cults. Like, how do you understand toxic or unhealthy forms of rootedness? I wonder if you could shed some insight on that.
Well, I'll just start with Fromm here, and then we can go to what I think.
Yeah, no, totally. That's kind of where I want to be.
Yeah, so I think Fromm would say that, you know, this is one of the more fascinating aspects of Fromm, where he would say that, you know, it's better to be in an unhealthy relationship, as messed up as it sounds, than it is to just constantly experience the existential contradiction of human existence. It's much more unbearable. Actually, he says it's more unbearable to experience the contradictions than to have the reprieve of being in something toxic like a cult, for example. Because a cult meets the fundamental need of rootedness and relatedness.
Totally.
You're a part of something bigger than yourself, but the characteristic of what that is could transform itself to some really, you know, some very toxic levels of codependency, for example, right? That don't necessarily bring about aspects of what Fromm would call, you know, like deep forms of love and this transformative experience of individuation, right?
Individuation, yeah.
Yeah. For him, individuation, like there's other, you know, other psychoanalysts would have different understandings of individuation, but for Fromm, at least in the way that I've understood it, is that individuation for Fromm has a paradoxical element to it, is recognizing the deep sense of separation that one has.
Yes.
And by having that separation, one simultaneously looks to transform oneself in some kind of community, right? In some kind of looking for that aspect that is missing in themselves to be able to enhance oneself. So you look for that other side to complete oneself. And if you can find that completion, if you can find that deep sense of relatedness, that actually self-actualizes you in a community, because self-actualization doesn't just exist in the individual, it also exists in the society.
Yeah.
And the society lets you self-actualize, you know, it with the characteristics that it holds, right? So if that society does not, you know, have healthy forms of self-actualization, then you'll never be fully individuated. But full individuation exists when there's a deep sense of love for the individual, where the individual retains its autonomy, but at the same time
freedom.
Freedom, but at the same time has that deep sense of collective
solidarity, responsibility.
Yes, that's exactly. See, deep sense of solidarity and responsibility with the collective, right?
Dude, okay, so in the little time that I've spent with Fromm and then now Kieran's work, I think my understanding of his understanding of individuation is exactly what you said. It's sort of like a sort of coming to terms with the human freedom that we all have, which again kind of creates these existential contradictions because we are separate, but it's not caving into it and then manifesting all this toxic stuff. It's individuating to the point where you have the capacity to love and to relate to others and to utilize your it's a freedom it's the capacity to be in solidarity and have a collective sense of responsibility without losing your sense of freedom or autonomy.
It's almost like if we're using the freedom from freedom to negative freedom, positive freedom.
Yeah.
If we're using that dichotomy or that frame of orientation, you know, you can say that there's actually a healthy balance between positive and negative freedom there. That no one or the other is taking more than what they need, right? It's all just, you know, I was thinking about it from a Marxist perspective, you know, to each according to their needs, to each according to their ability, right? Like that's where Fromm's coming from with this idea of individuation, never taking too much or too little, but also giving enough from oneself so that one can receive what they're giving in, right? Like that's the beauty of it. And I do, obviously it's hard to create spaces like that, especially in the society in which we live in. I don't think there's, adequate levels of spaces where there's balance like that. We're not even looking for balance. Like that's the problem. We don't ask questions of balance. We don't ask questions of harmony. Like that's something that we're lacking in our society, right?
Dude, and I'm going to make an assumption that your work in environmental studies could really speak to this in terms of how an ecology has balance and works together. I mean, I guess maybe to sharpen the question, like in your understanding and experience and study of the natural world, how has that influenced some of your thoughts on how humans could experience some of this balance?
Could you rephrase the question?
Sure. I guess I'm just wondering, in terms of everything you've studied, in terms of the environmental studies stuff, has that shaped the way you understand how an ecology works, or how we can kind of work together to create a type of balance? Is that an area where nature can kind of speak to humanity?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. That's actually an interesting question. I'm starting, because I'm a paradoxical thinker, just like Fromm is.
Sure. I appreciate that about y'all.
Yeah.
I hope I'm the same way.
I think if you haven't been calling yourself a paradoxical thinker, you definitely should start doing it, because the way we interact is very much, paradoxically dialectical, right? Like we ping off of each other in the way we have conversations, and like just even being on the podcast, like I think
absolutely
there's this like what is that dynamic energy that exists, right? This dynamism is a part of this paradox of existence. And all I do is that, like, when I look at ecology and when I look at, and there's a lot of thinkers who think this way. It's not just, I didn't come up with this on my own or anything like that.
This isn't a Rudyism?
It's not a Rudyism. There's, I'm building off of the greats here. I'm building off of giants.
Nice.
That's what I used to say, and I used to talk about with my advisor and folks that I used to interact with. We're building off of the greats who were doing this way before I even started thinking about it. All I'm doing is like I'm pushing the conversation forward, right? Like that's all I'm doing.
Nice.
I do see nature as just another facet of this paradoxical and dialectical element that exists in life. Like that's just life is life has different ways that it takes shapes and forms, right? Like I always talk about, the shapes and forms are always different.
Sure.
But the essence of life is I think has these basic essentialisms, right? And that's my orientation towards the ecological side of how I look at nature, and how I'm trying to talk about, Fromm's radical humanism isn't necessarily, and this goes back to Kieran, like it's not deterministically human. It's not a reification of humanity. It's not trying to even put humanity as like the top of the totem pole. It's just saying that, there's interesting things that humanity does with the essences of life, and that should be something that should be celebrated and also understood and looked at,
totally.
And also taken with caution too, because if humanity has beautiful things that it can provide, it also has dangerous and ugly aspects of itself, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that Fromm talks about, which I think is an incredible thing that he does, right?
Dude, totally. So one of the things that has struck me about Fromm is, I know one of the things that people will say to kind of critique him is that he was an idealist, or he believed ultimately in a type of utopia, or he was just too positive.
Yeah.
And my thinking is, but he also wrote a lot about human destructiveness. One of his greatest books, Escape from Freedom, is really trying to understand
I mean,
how
he has.
something like the Nazi Party was possible, right?
I mean, he also has the whole book on the anatomy of human destructiveness, where he talks
Exactly.
about where he gets into aggression and he gets into the darker sides of what it means to be human.
Right.
But he also says, even within that darker side, he uses the word productiveness. There's a productiveness that we can use with passion and aggression, and there's healthy forms of aggression, like things like that. That really, like the orientation he takes gives you interesting insights on this. What you think would be a black and white understanding. It's like, oh well, there's you have aggression and then you have passion, but it's actually like no. Even within aggression, there are existential contradictions that exist there. You don't have to go all the way to passion. Passion is its own thing. Aggression itself can be destructive, or it can be life producing.
Yeah,
And
that's
see
a great point.
That framework and orientation that he uses to kind of shine a light on that and split the hairs to show you these finely tuned lines that exist, I think are fascinating, right? They're fascinating the way that Fromm does that.
Yeah, dude, that's incredible. No, great point. So, okay, I know in a minute we were going to kind of jump into getting a little bit more personal, maybe practical, talking about Fromm and meditation. And you had some things you were going to talk about in terms of your own life and maybe even a class that you recently went to that I wanted to hear more about. But before we do that, I think this is maybe a good bridge. One of the existential needs that Kieran kind of ends with on the little segment on the existential anthropology is frame of orientation and devotion. And I know that he's also connected that to what Fromm might call the religious impulse in humanity, this need to have a narrative or a kind of a framework to understand what's happening. And then when it comes to devotion, I'm still trying to understand exactly what he means by devotion. I think I have a lot of negative connotations in my mind, having come from organized religion around the idea of devotion. Mm-hmm. So I kind of wanted to see, if Rudy had any thoughts on this need of frame of orientation and devotion before we get into meditation.
Yeah. So frame of orientation, we're literally doing that right now. Like the way we're talking about. So Fromm has a specific paradoxical framework, right? There's a philosophical anthropology. The philosophical anthropology is, I always say this to my students, like when we're talking about frameworks, when we're talking about worldviews, because that's what he's talking about there.
Yeah.
All worldviews have internal assumptions. And to understand how a framework and a frame of orientation kind of functions is to recognize the axioms and to recognize the
which would be like foundational principles
that exist, and the internal logic of how we can not just predict reality, but also understand and give a story to the various mechanisms that exist within reality. So we're giving. So to me, a frame of orientation, right? The way that Fromm talks about it, to me, is like we're giving categories and languages to phenomenon in existence so that we can understand what's going on out there. I always think, right, and Fromm would agree with this, and he says this, that not all frames of orientations are created equal. I stand to say that I 100% agree with that. I think some frames of orientation can capture reality a lot better than others, and other frames of orientations can lead to very destructive and unproductive ways of being, right? That can lead all human beings, anybody really. We all have the capacity to be very destructive. It just depends on the worldviews that we're orienting ourselves, right? That to me is like the guiding light to the choices we make, right? Like that's the important part. I remember, for example, yesterday, Gene, I saw an excerpt on James Baldwin, and Baldwin talked about, like everyone is capable of being that cop that is taking the humanity away from that Black person.
Yeah,
it's up to us to decide not to be those people. But that responsibility is framed on the orientation in which we live by, right? Like that's the worldview. So the worldview is very personal to us, but that worldview is really guiding the way we live our lives, right? And that also determines our character structure. It literally
Oh yeah.
determines our personality. So be very careful. Be very, very careful on the frames of orientations that you're exposed to and you're buying into. You have to almost be very, what is it like? Not just investigate, but also be very skeptical, and try to understand deeply what it is that you're actually letting seep into your mind, right?
Yeah.
Because you might not notice that you could be letting someone like Andrew Tate be dictating
Right.
the way you look at women, right? The way you look at the world. And someone like Andrew Tate Fromm would
It's a
say is
great example.
right, that would be a kind of unproductive and destructive form of orientation. While Andrew Tate is looking, like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, they're looking at the problem and diagnosing it correctly. But the solutions in their frame of orientation are adding more fuel to the fire that's recreating the fire, right?
Totally.
That's actually just creating this vicious cycle, right?
Sure.
So we need to look at the frame of orientation very, very, just interrogate that, and take time with it and be mindful about what we're thinking about. Especially
Yeah.
like my cousin, for example, that likes he's a very ambitious person, but there are ambitious books out there, that look at ambition as a drive for, what do you call it, like economic growth,
Greater capital.
profit motive, right? And
Oh
that's
yeah.
what that energy is being used for, which is not necessarily a more egalitarian and more collective way of using ambition to propagate the human race, right? To develop the human race to higher heights. Instead, it becomes a self-interested form of ambition. Just as an example, and then just to like switch on to devotion. I think devotion is a very interesting word that he uses because there's a book that he has called The Revolution of Hope.
Ooh, I like
And,
that.
and in that book, he has a very paradoxical way in which he understands hope, which is like it's always like it's almost like it has a level of faith to it.
Mm.
You need to hope isn't something that you think is going to happen. Hope is something that you hold on to because you know that the human capacity to change at any moment and transform who we are is always there, because that energy is always there.
Yeah.
The problem is that human beings aren't necessarily determined to actually take that turn, right? Like that's the freedom that exists
That's
within
the
that.
freedom.
But it's always to have to hold out the hope, even if we don't see it in our lifetime, is to hold out that faith. Like there's an aspect of faith in hope for Fromm, that speaks to this idea of devotion.
Yeah.
And it just means that I do think that like that aspect of devotion just means like that responsibility of the whole world doesn't need to be carried and burdened just on yourself.
Mm.
Like that responsibility of existence in the human race exists amongst all humans, and we need to share that burden together, right? That's that sense of solidarity that exists within all of us. We just need to enact it, right? That's a potentiality that we all have. We just need to actualize it, right? We need to actualize it.
Dude, that's great. Okay. So here's something that's coming up for me. I've never really thought about this in terms of even my own work as a therapist. Obviously, I haven't used this way of framing it yet. Maybe I will start with some of my clients who want to do some deeper work, but I want to just hear what you have to say. Like I'm kind of thinking, okay, so the big picture question that I want to ask you is, today in the modern world, where are the places where people can, to use your language, interrogate their frame of orientation? Because I think that's absolutely essential. And before you answer, I'll just kind of riff a little bit. I think, given what I do with some of my clients, it's actually a one kind of safe, creative space where they can begin to interrogate their frame of orientation. And I want to be careful with that. By that, I do not mean that I am imposing my beliefs or views or values on them. That would be unethical of me to do that as a therapist. But if they give me the permission and they want to do this work, I do see my role as asking the type of questions, helping them see some of their own unconscious dynamics that might lead to them wanting to, as you said, interrogate their frame of orientation.
Yeah, I would say that the university classrooms are are a good place to interrogate one's own frame of orientation. Obviously, that depends on.
And I happen to know somebody that I'm actually looking at right now that gets to do that work.
Yeah. There's what is it? It really does depend on the professor who's not even the professor, the human being who's standing up there and really trying to help students, right, interrogate their own frame of orientation without being unethical, right, without imposing their own beliefs on their students and telling them what to think. Because I'm not there to help to tell you what to think. I'm there to help you interrogate your own beliefs, right? What you think is static in reality might not be as static as you think it is if you start to interrogate it a little more than you have, right?
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. So, okay, maybe in the modern world, like the therapy office, the university classroom. I mean, right. Truly, I'm kind of thinking about it for the first time. Like, are there any other spaces where people get to do this work? I mean, I can already hear my past. Some people saying, well, maybe in certain religious settings, but I mean, maybe that's the case if it's kind of a healthy type of religion or spirituality.
Maybe, yeah.
I don't know. Like, I don't think the reason I hesitate to say like online or in social media is that I just think there are these echo chambers, right? Where we're just having our frame of orientation reinforced rather than interrogated.
I've met, for example, mystical scholars who, not just scholars, but also like mystics who are practicing, in a religious context, creating community, like actual organic community that they're creating. They don't need to meet each other on Sundays. They probably like, come together democratically, suggest which days they want to meet, and they meet those days, and then they have like these spaces to be able to, critically interrogate each other. Not just each other, but also themselves, right? Like, it's about reflecting on each other, right? Like that's the whole point. And there are spaces within religious connotations that's totally possible to do that.
Sure.
But you're right. Like I would say that like within organized religion, it's a lot more proselytizing.
Yeah.
Then there is like this like critical interrogation of the foundational beliefs, right? Like that's that's the problem with organized religion.
Do you think the kind of renaissance of psychedelic research, I mean, could that whole realm/world be a place where people get to explore their frame of orientation and
it could be
have it interrogated?
I don't necessarily think it's a guarantee by any stretch of the imagination.
Sure. Maybe one tool.
Psychedelics are a tool to. It's also very easy to create spaces to be able to interrogate one's frame of orientation by using psychedelics. But I would never say that it's a guarantee that that's what's happening, right? Like you saw Mad Men. If you ever saw the show Mad Men,
dude,
right?
That's my favorite show of all time. Yeah.
So there's an episode there where they use psychedelics to be more creative about their advertising. And they weren't questioning the frame of orientation there. They were totally buying into this idea of like, hey, we got to create profit for the company. What's the most creative way to do this, right? And I'm saying, hey, look at that, psychedelics, we could do that.
Oh yeah.
Right? That's and then to me, that's an unproductive form of using psychedelics, because it has more of a not reified, but an instrumentalized, an instrumental form of using psychedelics that are not as productive as something as trying to create more human solidarity with each other, right?
Totally.
Just as an example.
Yeah, no, it's a great one. Okay, so would you be cool maybe for the next 5 minutes or so, maybe talking about meditation from a kind of from a Frommian perspective? And one thing I'll say, I don't know much about how he understood meditation, but in doing some research, I did see that he kind of meditated every day. Like it wasn't just something he wrote about, like he actually practiced it. He saw it as an essential practice in his life.
So I actually think that he has a book on not meditation specifically, but on mindfulness.
Oh, okay.
He wrote it with D.T. Suzuki. It's called Zen Buddhism and Psychoanalysis. Like that's
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I think it was
I'm
actually
on it.
like
I want to
it
check that
wasn't
one
really.
out.
I don't think it was a book. It was turned into a book, but I think it was lectures, if I remember
Lectures.
correctly.
Okay.
Yeah,
That
it was
was just
lectures
turned
with
into
D.T.
a book.
Suzuki. Yeah, what was turned into a book. And in there he talks about meditation and mindfulness as a way to individuate, just as an example, right?
Okay.
Because I remember like last time we were talking about how there's languages to talk about human experience, or like languages to talk about experience, and one way to, I think, an important language to be able to capture human experience, or any kind of experience really, is the language of practice, right? Like to be able to put theory into practice, right? Or put theory into practice, and then Marxists would call that praxis. And I do think that there's a connection there, because one thing is to talk about rationally, to talk about things rationally, and then another thing is to provide meaning, right? The impact of meaning into words. And the only way to have impact and meaning is to be able to associate the words and the categories to actual transformative experiences, right? To have in your repertoire the recollection of what it means to experience certain kinds of words that might not mean anything if someone's never had an experience.
Totally.
Like an ego death, for example. Ego death just means something to someone. It's just a word if you've never actually had the profound subjective experience to actually talk about it, right?
Oh, yeah.
So meditation to me is a practice that has profound explanation. That once we've really captured what it means to experience meditation, we can reflect on that and then bring it into categories and talk about them into words, right? So when we're talking about complexifying and getting closer to the nuances of existence, of what it means to be alive, what it means to exist, I think meditation is one of the important categories of practice to actually do what we're talking about on here, right? The sense of solidarity with everything in existence, you can actually reach that through meditation, right? If you do it long enough. There's also a sense of like what it means, like the word nothingness, for example, in a Zen Buddhist sense, actually means everything. Everything is nothing, and nothing is everything, right? But you don't really get to understand what that means unless you actually experience it yourself, right? To reach those states, one can do that through the practice of meditation, as an example. And also too, like I recently had I've been going actually to these spaces where these folks are doing like kind of like a Korean Taoism, like that's the philosophy that they're embodying within their own practices. And as I've been going to their center and their spaces, they do Tai Chi, right? Tai Chi is another practice that you can do to have like this mind-body connection. To create a mind-body connection, there's certain breath work that you can do, and then there's also things that you can do with your body that creates more connection, right? Because I do think that throughout the day, as we're experiencing our lives and we're going about our busy days, and we have that busy body, we create distance between our body and our mind. Because our society creates distance between our body and our mind, right? Like that's a characteristic aspect of what Fromm would call the marketing orientation. The marketing orientation divides like that. There he goes, the mind is divided because our society divides and influences us to divide ourselves throughout the day. And what we have to do is create meditative practices, right? Mindfulness practices, to kind of remind ourselves that we aren't actually divided. We're just identifying with the divisions, right? This idea of identification.
Dude, that's so
also,
good.
right? Yeah, I can stop now. You can
No,
keep
man.
going.
No, just
Yeah,
thank you so much for going there. Yeah.
yeah,
Maybe, and this is, okay. So this is a concept that I want to kind of come back to maybe next time or whenever, but, and I want to bring it up because I think like in new age circles, I think this would get like ridiculed in certain more rigorous philosophical communities. But from, I've read several things where he actually wanted to emphasize the importance of self-love, that self-love is actually really a crucial way to think about kind of his philosophy and his psychoanalysis kind of as a whole, really. And
yeah.
I'm wondering what you think he meant by self-love. I wonder if you could just kind
Oh,
of reflect on that for a little bit.
yeah, yeah. Oh man, self-love. Well, just in the art of loving itself, I think one of the foundational pieces of self-love for Fromm is that, uh, you can never enter into a relationship with another person if you've never understood what it means to love yourself, right?
Mm,
And I know that sounds almost like a cliche, right? Something you can put on a wallpaper in your house or something. But this is where I would go back to this idea of languages of practices that give meaning to the words. And even though that's not necessarily universal, because if someone just thinks that that's some spiritual mumbo jumbo, uh, you know, uh, words that you just hear as a truism, then
right.
you'll identify it that way. See, that's what human beings do. We tend to attach to the experiences we've had. And if our experiences do not relate to specific words, then you're going to scoff at it and you're not going to take it seriously. That's always the case. That's always the case. Always happening. There is, like Fromm would say, there's like human beings are judgment prone creatures.
Mm,
But what we need to do is we need to develop our judgment, right? Like judgment is really, really important because that's also uh, a unique aspect of human experience. There's not a lot of creatures out there that can make judgment calls on things, right?
totally.
But also, our judgment can be the downfall of us as well. If we tend to judge too quickly, then we don't give the level of attention that maybe something is required to have to be able to understand something deeply, right? And
Mm,
we tend to shut that off from ourselves, and then that's an aspect of reality that we might be shutting ourselves off from. Just as an example, right? I think judgment is like a gatekeeping mechanism to
mm,
allow us whether we want to expand or retract ourselves,
right.
right? And I think self-love holds within it already an aspect of that form of judgment. I do think that one needs to expand judgment in such a way where we're so loving that we, even if we hear just pure ignorance from somebody, that we have the empathy and compassion to be able to see them in the same way that we see ourselves. And that's hard. That's hard to do,
Yes, it
right? That is
is.
very hard to do, but it's also, a deep level of wisdom to be able to do that, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
also, and I think Fromm definitely had that form of self-love to be able to see someone and not judge them because they're not at the same level as he is, but also have a level of empathy to
Yeah.
want to see the potentiality in that person that they don't see in themselves yet. Yet.
Dude,
Yeah.
yet. No, and that's crucial. Yeah, I think definitely within a Frommian lens, self-love would not be selfishness or a type of narcissism, but it's a recognition of our freedom. It's moving towards solidarity in others because we're also at peace with ourselves. And I don't know that it's a one before the. I think it's dialectical. We experience positive relatedness with others, and that helps us experience self love. And then through esteeming ourselves and accepting who we are, we can then relate better to others. I think it goes both ways. But I guess I just wanted to throw out. I definitely don't see self love as a narcissistic, selfish reality. It's something that's actually quite important to embody, to
Yeah.
have the type of solidarity that I think Fromm is pushing us toward.
Right. I think from a Fromm perspective, self-love already requires the other.
The other, yes.
requires the other. Like to really actualize self-love, one needs to be able to reflect on oneself, the love that you're trying to give to yourself, but you also have to do that with others, right? You have to give that to others.
Yeah.
Right. There's a sense of, I think Fromm with this idea of love, like has a certain level of he talks about responsibility, knowledge, sacrifice, right? And appreciation for others that we need to have, because if we don't have that in ourselves, we can't practice those things. This goes back to, everything we're talking about is like, the virtue ethics of Aristotle are deeply influential in Fromm, right? And Fromm has a kind of Aristotelian virtue ethics there,
right?
Where it's like one needs to practice what one is preaching, not just that, in order for me to become a virtuous person, I need to do this through the practices of virtue themselves, right? I don't just hold within myself, even though I have the potentiality of being brave, just as an example, doesn't mean that I know how to actualize what being brave is.
Yeah,
and the only way for me to do that is to be tested, right? I need to test my virtues. How do you test your virtues? By being in contact with other people who don't necessarily see the world in the same way that you do.
That's a great point.
Right. And then to be a better brave person, one needs to face one's fears and so you practice being brave because you feel fear, right? Like that's always I always use it as like my
it's a great example.
My ideal expression of Aristotelian virtue ethics that Fromm really, really buys into as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Okay, Rudy, I know I've kind of come to the end of the things that I wanted to explore and ask you. Is there anything else before we sign off? I know this won't be the last episode on Fromm, but is there anything else that you feel like we miss exploring in terms of the needs or the existential anthropology?
Yeah. Let's see. We talked about. I think we did a pretty good job. Yeah, we did a pretty good job of like covering everything that you wanted to cover. What is it? I'll just say this, like, just to finish off on self-love, right? Like, well,
sure.
Self-love, right? Just lastly also means the solidarity with all of humanity, right? And then I would also add into it, not just the complete solidarity with all of humanity, right? You must love yourself as you love the complete concept of what it means to be a part of the human race. But also, self-love in nature as well. Like to love oneself because nature itself like exists in love, right? Someone who really, really like resonates with that and is like James Baldwin. Again, James Baldwin, he's so amazing. He's such a great human being, and he embodies this. He experienced so much hatred as a black man in America, but yet he chose to buy into the idea of the deep solidarity with all of humanity, and never chose to be bitter about it, because he knew that there's a deeper potentiality in human beings and in nature itself, right? Like I'm adding that into it, that it existed, like it exists, it's there, and to deny that would be to deny ourselves, right? And that's the problem, that I would never want to deny an aspect of my reality and also of my capacity as a human being. And that's a recognition of my own love that exists everywhere in the world. All we have to do is just manifest that. We need to manifest that in dark spaces where that's not necessarily, where it's being hidden, right? I would think of it as like large swaths of shadows just hiding these forms of love. All we need to do is bring it into existence, manifest it into existence, and remind people that it's constantly there. Because we're always focusing on the darkness, but we never focus. It's harder to focus on the light than it is to focus on the darkness. And in the darkness, that beautiful sense of love and deep solidarity of human beings needs to exist. It needs to exist because the darkness exists because of that deep solidarity with everything existing, right?
Totally. Man, that is a powerful vision of a radical humanism, I think.
That is 100% Fromm's radical humanism, right there. I'm just adding the natural element to it, right?
Which
To
I'm
me,
glad
it's
you
just
are. I'm glad you
that's
are.
that extra layer. That's that extra layer where I'm like, well, if we're doing it with humanity, it's also there in nature because we are nature.
Because we
There's
are
no
nature.
separation. Yeah.
Right. 100%. All right, dude. Well, hey, thank you again for your time. And I look forward to the next one.